Well, they did it to us again. As you all know, they released 25 minutes of footage in a recent Sony State of Play that was more packed than the PAX footage I just looked at a couple weeks ago. So, in a similar vein to the PAX footage, a lot of scenes were repeats, but there's quite a bit of new information mixed in there, as well as confirmations on old theories. So, this is a first, but if you are more sensitive to spoilers, you should click away now. I'm glad you came to my video, but generally, they're pretty spoiler heavy, and at this point, it's not just me making educated guesses, the game has even confirmed some plot points. I will refer to my own theories in this video by saying things like, we knew it was X thing that I had guessed, or something similar to that. When I say things like that, I'm referring to my old videos where I've laid the foundation for my current working theories. If you have questions about them, please go check them out in my previous videos. I would start with, I can tell you Final Fantasy 16 story, as it's the foundation for everything we talk about. With all that out of the way, let's get moving, because this is another really long one. The State of Play opens with a scene that we're all familiar with. The scene of Clive and the Imperial soldiers around a campfire where the sergeant says the infamous, "You all know the target, Shiva's dominant, and only the dominant." This time, with new takes for the line reads, which in my opinion sound a lot better. I didn't include this for line reads though. Instead, it confirms an old theory where we saw a screenshot of Clive fighting what appeared to be the sergeant. However, in the shot, Clive was being referred to as Wyvern. Here, the sergeant, whose call sign is Tiamat, is calling Clive Wyvern. This confirms what we had all thought was most likely, which is that the Imperial army that Clive is a part of uses call signs instead of names, and Clive's call sign is Wyvern. Now let's jump to the scene of young Clive fighting some goblins in the swamp. We already kind of knew about this from the Awakening trailer, way back when. However, you'll notice that there's another person with Clive. In fact, there's two people with Clive. One of these people has to be the person I guessed in my Ambition trailer breakdown. It seems to be a bit of a childhood friend who will act as our party member for young Clive for a portion of the game, seen here. We then cut to one of the big bombshells of the trailer. We are playing as Joshua in what seems to be the past. Now, I've talked before how the game developer said at the beginning of the game you'll play as someone else, like Rex in Final Fantasy XII. My gut is telling me that this is it. I had originally assumed that it would be like Final Fantasy XII where it opens up with someone else, but truthfully the developers never said that explicitly. They just said it'd be like Final Fantasy XII in response to a question from a press journalist. So at the start of the game, after he plays Clive for a bit out in the swamp, we then return to Joshua during the assassination attempt. He appears to be a lot more fragile than Clive, so I think the developers are using this gameplay section as a way to tell a story through gameplay. Now, there's still a chance that the game opens with someone else, like maybe playing as Barnabas, but I'm not totally convinced now. It'll also be interesting to see if there's a pattern of us playing as other dominants as they're off doing their own thing in the story, like us playing as Jill or Sid. We then have a quick scene of Ifrit dodging some rocks in what appears to be Drake's Fang, the Earth aspected Mother Crystal in Dalmacia. You can see the yellow crystals all along the cave, which is kind of a giveaway. The interesting thing here is the glow that is in the center of the cavern, which appears to be between two giant mountain-shaped rocks coming from the floor and the ceiling. As many other people think, I believe this is most likely where Titan transforms into Titan Lost, through some sort of ceremony with the Mother Crystal. I have no clue if this is Hugo doing it of his own volition, or related to the Hooded Man, or maybe Titan doing it himself, but it definitely appears to be when Titan transforms. Now we get to a map, and this map is a lot more stylized than the previous maps we've seen, and makes the blight more obvious. So, if you're wondering what the black portions are, it's the blighted areas. It correlates with the old map that we've seen as well. This also shows that the Hideaway is in a blighted area as well. Another interesting tidbit is that there are areas mostly to the south outside of the Five Nations in the Dominion that aren't actually blighted. It makes me wonder if these areas might come up during the storyline, as they're almost like lost areas that are likely inhabited, just not governed by a nation anymore as they're hard to get to. So it's just a possibility for the writers if they want to explore that. We then see more context to the falling rock scene that we saw in the Awakening trailer way back when. Clive and this other soldier named Bios, which is another type of dragonkin, which we've seen in Final Fantasy XIV, are sliding down a hill when a rock from the Shiva Titan fight comes down and crushes him. Clive also almost gets hit by a falling tower and the screen goes black. Now, it's implied here that this is when the flashback will happen, as you see young Clive getting woken up by having some water splashed on his face. And that is possible, but it could also just be smooth editing. More importantly though is, I've talked to some people and some people who have watched this seem to think, based on what Koji Fox is saying, that the flashbacks will occur in multiple smaller segments. I want to clarify that this flashback will almost certainly be one giant flashback. We've seen that all the tutorial screens from the press footage was a young Clive, implying that this is when the tutorials will pop up. Plus, there's really nothing to hide in the flashback, which is something that we'll see later, as we've already seen everything that happens in the flashback, and they've told us. So the flashback really just gives context as to how Clive got to be in the situation he's currently in, working for the Empire with the brand on his cheek. Then let's go to the world map that they show right after. I had said in my PAX trailer video that I had wanted to see the world map from an earlier point of view to confirm that the Empire's Crystal had really fallen, as that map had the Empire's Crystal, Rosaria's Crystal, and Dhalmekia's Crystal all gone. Here we can see that the world map does in fact start with all 5 crystals. What that means is that in the PAX footage at that point in the story, which is shortly after the Hugo fight I believe, the Empire's Mother Crystal is somehow already destroyed. Based on my theories on story progression, I'm almost positive that we don't destroy it, and if we did, we would have seen something related to it by now. Instead, my guess is that Barnabas actually has destroyed it, because as we know, he also wants to destroy the Mother Crystals based on his quote on the JP website. So chances are while we're in Rosaria and Dhalmekia, he's busy fighting the Empire and somehow manages to destroy their Mother Crystal. Now besides that, this map also shows that we've only been to the Empire and Rosaria, which lines up with my previous theories. The next part of the video, they show off a bunch of landscapes. Remember while we're watching this that Clive's armor can tell us roughly where the scene takes place in the game, whether it's early with the Imperial armor or later in the game with Clive's red and black armor, or if we see his face, if he's missing the brand. So the first one I want to stop on really quickly is this one. We can see a little boy using a crystal that looks like a frost crystal to probably cool and preserve the fish that are in the bucket. This kind of shows how they might use magic in their day-to-day life and why the crystals are so important. You might have also missed on this scene that Clive isn't just standing in front of a big log. There's actually a giant troll holding on to that big log. So Clive must have either just killed it or maybe he stumbled upon it and we're investigating it. Moving on, we then go to some ancient ruins. There's this thing that likely is some sort of control module coming up out of the ground where Clive is. My guess is this might be an elevator given the arena shape and the fact that we've seen multiple fights with Clive in a round elevator. Then we see another set of ancient ruins that's really interesting. The mural from the end of the Ambition trailer is painted on the wall, however most of it is black and covered in cracks, leaving only the figure at the top to be discernible. So we know the bottom part of the mural portrays all the icons besides Phoenix and Ifrit, and the top is theorized to be Diablos and maybe some combination of Ifrit and Phoenix, since they're both missing. Now obviously this is hugely symbolic, and given that it's in some fallen ancient ruins, I have to believe that the symbology links back to them. Now, there are a lot of interpretations that are possible, and honestly, this could be a video unto itself, but to summarize my thoughts, I think it basically symbolizes one of two things. One is that the bottom icons are all blighted or corrupted, leaving only the figure at the top to stop the progression of the blight and maybe save them. The second interpretation comes from the fact that the bottom 7 icons all had halos while the top one didn't, and maybe the 7 icons did something way back when to betray the ancient civilization, and it led to someone destroying the mural, leaving only the one figure that didn't betray the rest of the civilization. Needless to say, I think this mural will have significant meaning in the story at large, even if it's just retrospectively. The next scene is another market in a city with Imperial banners everywhere. Now, this could be Rosaria or the Empire at first glance, since we know the Empire took over Rosaria and drapes their banners everywhere. The giveaway, though, is actually kind of hidden. In the top right, between the gate and the tower, you'll see the edge of the Imperial Mother Crystal, which tells us this is in fact the Imperial capital. Now, let's cut ahead to the ship. Now, this ship might be the Enterprise. In fact, I would guess it probably is. If you look at the ship in the dock, though, the dock is built on some ancient ruins, and the ship itself has the same ancient look with white plating all over it. Not just that, it seems to use some sort of jet engine, which, given the setting of the rest of the game, tells me that it's probably an ancient ship using ancient tech. We then see the ship sailing out of port before turning on its engines and speeding off towards this huge ship on the horizon. Now, I've been trying to figure out what the ship on the horizon might be. The purple sails make me think of Waloed as their crystal is purple, but really it could be Waloed or the Iron Kingdom in my opinion, as they're both countries that would have to sail to the main continent in order to invade. And really the Iron Kingdom is more of a seafaring nation than Waloed is. Now that was a big, dense section. But now let's move on to the action scenes. Here, I only really want to remind everyone that the icons they're showing likely aren't acquired by that stage of the game. They've shown before and are now that they have all the icons unlocked at earlier points of the games using dev tools or New Game Plus. Now, after going through all these fight scenes, a lot of these I've talked about before. Some are new, but they're taking place in environments we've seen before. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to skip over this part for now. If you want to know more about the scenes, I think my PAX footage covers almost all of these environments, including the desert and forest, so go check that out. Now this brings us to the abilities section. I believe I've discussed it before, but it looks like there's 7 icons around the one central one, and the central one is Clive's normal skills, and then Ifrit is in the dead center. Now we can't equip Ifrit like the other icons, so the chances are the Will o' the Wisp skill that they learn in this demonstration is likely used when Clive limit breaks, along with the other 2 skills in that circle. It also shows the order of the icons that we get, which is Phoenix, Garuda, Ramu, and Titan, which lines up with previous theories. There is a theory out there based on the autosave icon, which has 8 circles around one central one, that They might be trying to hide an 8th icon that we can use. And I kind of like this theory because knowing these devs from Final Fantasy XIV, they tend to try to hide at least some things to make sure that the player is surprised when they actually play the expansion. And given that they've shown us all 7 extensively now, with Shiva in this most recent one, there really isn't anything in the action combat that would hugely surprise anyone. And I think the devs would want to try to surprise people. Next, they show off the timely accessories, and they've been talked to death about. If you want my opinion, I've already made a video on it, so you can go check that out. It is interesting that they did show the title screen and probably the music that goes with it, which was something I was looking forward to, so that's kind of nice. Now we get to a new in-game cutscene. Here we open with Clive asking Cid about how they're surviving in a blighted land in some ancient ruins, while a big man carries Jill on a chair on his back. Cid basically explains that they're in the ruins to keep the black from their lungs, which seems like something important with blighted lands. Maybe if you spend too much time in them, you develop black lung, similar to coal miners, which would eventually kill you. Then we see the reunion of Clive and Jill. As we all know, these are childhood friends who were both captured and forced to fight for different factions. This really just gives some characterization and some backstory that we mostly already knew, but it is nice to see their interactions again. The next scene is one that we've seen before, which is Clive fighting an assassin in the woods. This time though, there's a UI so we can see that the assassin is named the Midnight Raven. I'm still not positive about what country this assassin is from, but like before, we know that we're heading in the direction of the castle with Benedicta, and thus they're probably from the Empire or Waloed. There's then a quick scene of Ramu in what appears to be a crystal cave. Based on the blue crystals in the background, I think this might be the blue mother crystal with the crystalline dragon fight that we've seen before. So it looks like Cid probably transforms during that fight with the dragon. There's then a few other scenes, but while the enemies may be new, their locations are things that we've all seen before. The most interesting one to me is probably the Republican War Panther scene. We see it's in some sort of hall or church or something, and there's dead bodies all over the place. Meanwhile, 3 men watch from the gate outside. Given the aesthetic and the architecture and the scenery outside, this looks like it's somewhere in Dalmatia. So this makes me wonder what's going on in the scene, as Clive being level 16 in Dalmatia doesn't make a ton of sense. The dead bodies imply that something huge happened. Maybe the Panther came in and killed all these people. And since we're fighting a Republican War Panther, for those who don't know, Dalmatia is a republic, so whenever you see Republican, they aren't talking about US politics, they're talking about Dalmatia. We then have another in-game cutscene that must take place right after the introduction we saw earlier. Here, a red-haired woman with a burned-off brand mark, much like the one Clive has later in the game, tells Goats to take Jill upstairs to see the healer. This tells us that the big man's name is Goats, which is relevant, as in the PAX quest we saw that we were told to search for him, so he may stay relevant for most of the game. Then Cid says not to worry because they're the best healer this side of the belt. Now I have 2 ideas as to what this belt might be. One is the strip of water that separates the 2 continents. So basically Cid is saying that they're the best healer on this continent. The other thing that the belt might refer to is this central pathway that is clearly marked on the map that connects Rosaria to the Crystalline Dominion. If that is the belt, then Cid would be saying that they're the best healer on the southern side of this continent. This is when Clive is given time to freely roam the hideaway and when the game will likely start to open up a bit. We then see Clive shopping at Charon's Toll, but this time with new equipment. I do want to point out that the descriptions of the Imperial equipment that Clive is currently wearing kind of tells us what the Imperials think of the bearers, which is that they think nothing of them. And not just that, but it basically says that the Imperial bearers are used as assassins to kill other bearers, and thus the Empire sees them as expendable and worthless. This kind of explains the suicide mission to kill Shiva's dominant that Clive and his groupmates were sent on, and something that I theorized long ago. We then see some side quest content. Now, I'm not sure how important these quests will be, but there's some interesting info in here. One, it gives us location names for some places that we visit, such as the Trans-Rosarian Aqueduct, Martha's Rest, or Lost Wing. We also kind of saw these on the world map earlier. Second, it gives us the local map at the location, which gives us an idea of how the maps might look in the game. And based on these maps, I get absolutely huge Final Fantasy XII impressions with the map layouts. Like if you look at this Osmone Plain map and got rid of all of the loading screens, it looked kind of similar to this random Final Fantasy XVI map. So again, it gives us some idea as to how the game might play with the maps and how linear or wide it is. And at these points, it looks fairly linear, but like a wide linear with branching side paths and maybe some interesting things to do. We then travel to Lost Wing in the Holy Empire. This area seems to be a village built in some ancient ruins. Chances are, since this is so early in the game, we probably visit here when we're on our way to the castle where Benedicta is. Also, you'll notice that the main quest here is called Righting Wrongs, which tells us to search for the Dame. So look out for the Dame in future videos as they might be important. We are then introduced to a new side character whose appearance definitely doesn't match their name. Mid. Now we see that Clive in the scene no longer has his brand, so this is happening later on in the game, but Clive is already familiar with her. The other interesting part is that her somewhat funny name is actually a reference to Final Fantasy V, where Mid is the grandson of Sid, and given the director's history with Final Fantasy V, chances are this is a reference to that game, and Mid may even be Sid's daughter or niece or something like that. Then we cut to these two people standing behind a counter, and this is something that is actually super interesting. See that man on the left? He's the same guy that we just saw a couple scenes ago in the Hideaway. So this actually poses an interesting question. Why is he out here in this area which has sunlight and the sound of waves and no ruins, when originally he's in the Hideaway, which is buried in some mountain? Not just that, we know that this happens later in the game because of Clive's lack of brand. Now, my theory right now is that at some point in the game, after we fight Hugo, the Hideaway is actually attacked and we're forced to move shop to a new location. This theory is supported by a scene in the new music video, but since I'm not going to talk about that in depth today, we'll put that on the back burner, but keep it in mind. And watch out for that future video that I'm definitely going to make on the new music video, as it gives a bunch of information. We then see the Patron's Whisper, which, if I'm reading the menu correctly, seems like it's a way to get rewards for doing certain things in the world. My guess is that doing certain side content rewards you with renown that you can then get tiered rewards for, since the donation doesn't actually spend any renown. They then show off hunts a little bit. We knew that these existed, but it's nice to see it. But linking onto the previous scene with the renown, you can see in the bottom right, completing this hunt rewards you with 10 renown. So at the very least, doing hunts will give you renown, which will then give you rewards. One other little interesting fact is if you look in the top left, you can see the hunt icon. This also showed up when you talked to the Moogle about the hunts, which, by the way, the Moogle actually isn't named Otto. They introduced the Moogle on Twitter and their name is Nectar. I find it likely that Otto might be the man that I talked about before, potentially. So anyway, the icon in the top left is actually a rogue tomato from Final Fantasy XII, which, if you don't know, the rogue tomato is the first hunt that you do in Final Fantasy XII when you're introduced to the hunting system. So I think it's just a neat little reference back. I also want to note that the way they presented it, it doesn't look like Final Fantasy XII hunts where you have to go and talk to the quest giver before doing the hunt, but that step could just have been edited out. Next up is the lore section of the state of play, and oh boy, was there some juicy stuff buried in here. But most of you have probably already seen it. Regardless, we can start with Harpocrates, who seems to level up your wisdom as you unlock more lore bits. My guess is there has to be hidden forms of lore, maybe through conversations or collectible tomes that give more information about the world, since having a leveling system wouldn't make sense otherwise if you just got it all doing MSQ. Besides that, this is really just something that exists in case you need to refresh yourself on how things work in the world. We then talk to Vivian, who basically gives updates to the current state of the realm and what happened in the past story events. So for example, I think they use this for, like, if you stop playing the game for a week and you come back and you need a refresher, you can go and talk to her. Or alternatively, maybe something happened and you lost track of the names and faces and countries, and so you can come back here to figure out what exactly happened. The big thing is, though, that when they showed the system off, they had to spoil certain plot events in order to show it to us. First, let's start off with young Clive, who is the first shield of Rosaria. Under the summary, they basically state that Rosaria aims to capture Drake's breath from the Iron Kingdom, but before going to war, they have to participate in an ancestral communion. It's pretty apt since we know that Phoenix is passed through their bloodline and he's known for rebirth. So that explains why the Archduke, Joshua, and Clive all go out to Phoenix Gate where they're ambushed. Then, under the persons of interest, you can see that the names of the characters who are relevant at this point in time. The interesting thing is that with the Invictus description that I read in my last video, I had guessed that the blonde man who was with the Duke all the time was Rodney Murdoch, as it says that the Invictus was his sword that was bestowed to him by the Duke. Rodney is the general of the Duke's army, and based on the tree, I think I was right. You'll see the names go in an order from the center outwards, so Rodney would be the person after the Duchess Annabella, and since he's slightly further out than the Duchess, I think that lines up. They then skip forward slightly to the Night of Flames. Here we see the mysterious stranger pop up, the Archduke dies, and Joshua is believed dead. The description explains that the Empire acted with the former Duchess Annabella to capture or assassinate Joshua. So Annabella, again, is Joshua and Clive's mother. This is also when the two icons of fire fight, Ifrit and Phoenix. Also, take note at the bottom that there's an actual timeline that they put in the game. The yellow section is the year 860, the blue section is the year 873, and the red section is 878 to present day. At least present day when Clive is talking to Vivian here. And that's really what I want to emphasize. As I said earlier, this is a way for you to get refreshed on the story bits. And so what's pretty obvious to me here is that Clive is talking at a future date, probably with his brand burned off at this point, to Vivian, and it's showing more of the timeline than what they show us. And so that shows us that there's definitely a 5-year time skip from 873 to 878. My guess is this likely takes place sometime after our fight with Titan Lost and Hugo. And I also want to say that This does not mean that there can't be another time skip. The way they've been doing the marketing, they've only talked about the 3 phases of Clive's life. However, they could say do another 5-year time skip and Clive would go from 33 to 38. So it's still feasible to have another time skip while Clive is still in his 30s, just late 30s. We then skip forward 13 years. At this point in time, Clive is marked as an Imperial bearer, hence the brand on his cheek, so we know that. We can also see Barnabas, Benedicta, Hugo, Jill, as well as the Republic leaders I mentioned in my PAX video, and the Lord Commander of Elude, who was the person that we saw here, and we've long been trying to guess who they were. In fact, this slide tells us exactly what's going on in that scene. Basically, the Dalmecs are asking their old allies of Elude for help in the fight against the Iron Kingdom in the wastes of Dalmecia. Meanwhile, Clive and the other bears and a small group of Imperial soldiers infiltrate in pursuit of their own target, and, well, you all know the target. We then see this little descriptor of Jill, and interestingly, it tells us point blank that we actually fight Jill at the end of the level, and before we kill her, Clive's memories return to him. You see, it's been 13 years, so Clive doesn't even recognize Jill at first. So, to clarify this, we actually fight Jill, and basically at the beginning of the game. Maybe it's the half icon form, since I can't see us fighting full-on Shiva, at least not at the very start of the game. Then they pop up a in-depth descriptor of Jill, which actually mentions something that I've thought for a long time, and that is that Jill remains back at the castle as Joshua, Clive, and the Duke ride out to Phoenix Gate. So I've long wondered how Jill gets captured by the Iron Kingdom, since it's the Empire that invades, and this is one part of the answer. The next is coming up soon. But first, on the situation map, we see that Clive was enslaved by the Imperial Army on his mother's orders. But I think, somewhat more interestingly, the description just says that Clive blacks out during the Phoenix attack and is found in the rubble the next morning. This description actually supports the idea that Clive could have somehow been involved as Ifrit that night, and maybe he just doesn't remember it since he lost control of himself. Circling back around, we can see how Jill actually got captured. Here we see that after the Duke dies, the Iron Kingdom invades and captures Rosalith, the capital. At this point in time, the Iron Kingdom must capture Jill before being driven out by the Empire at a later date. Alright, the final slide. This time it's mostly what we've already seen. However, on the right side, we do see something interesting. At the end, it says that Clive is saved from certain death from a stranger named Sid. Now, I've long thought, based on the cutscenes we've seen, that Sid somehow gets involved when Clive meets Jill, but it's nice to know that basically we almost killed Jill, realize who she is, and at this point I have to assume we have to betray our comrade, the Sergeant, Tiamat, and this is likely where that picture comes from. My guess is that we almost lose and die to the Sergeant when Sid arrives and actually saves us. We then have some other fight scenes, like the one with Fafnir that is happening in some fallen ruins, but this and the Midnight Raven fight aren't a bunch of new information, as we've seen the environments before. Then in the Hugo half-transformed fight, while we've seen snippets of it before, this stage seems a little different to me, but maybe I'm misremembering. We can see that there are statues in the background of different men holding different weapons, and on the ground it's all dirt. Whereas before, you'll remember a lot of the fights seem to be happening within this castle, which I had theorized was Rosaria. So it seems like there's either a stage change or this is taking place at another point in time. Based on my theories, it's either in Rosaria, like I said, or it's maybe in Drake's Fang somewhere, as we know that we fight Titan in Drake's Fang. Then we see Clive on an elevator fighting a control node. If the level is accurate, this is the furthest into the game we've seen so far. So obviously this is us fighting some security in some fallen ruins. Same with the next scene with the Aurum Giant. Again, Clive is the same level, so it might be taking place in the same dungeon and maybe even on the same elevator. In which case, that's gotta be a really long elevator. Then we see the end of the Liquid Flame fight. We had seen a very small snippet of this before with Jill as Shiva helping us, but we weren't sure what was going on as it was so long ago and we didn't have a ton of information. But to summarize, this fight basically takes place at the end of the Volcano dungeon, which is Drake's Breath. In fact, we can see Drake's Breath Mother Crystal in the background as we're fighting, and we also see Jill as Shiva in the background. Since it's Liquid Flame, she probably transformed into Shiva to try to cool him down in order for us to land attacks on him. As many people may know, when lava cools, it turns into rock. Then we have the fight with the half-transformed Barnabas. Now, again, we've seen this stage before, but it's our first time seeing him half-transformed. Also, I find it interesting that if the levels are accurate, we seem to be fighting him on top of a spire. You see, we just took the elevator up some ancient ruins at level 36, and we're currently fighting him at level 37. Therefore, I suspect this fight might be taking place at some ancient ruins, which has interesting story implications. Finally, we get onto the icon battles. Now, they've shown us basically all of these battles before, besides one in particular. So first, let me remind you of the Bahamut fight. We actually saw this fight at PAX, however, not to the same scope. Remember, I had mentioned that we were fighting on some giant flower, and then it had some interesting implications, and I referenced back to Devil May Cry 5. Here we see a new ability with Clive firing a giant laser, but story-wise there's nothing really new. The same is true of the Titan fight. We've seen it before, but it is interesting to learn that Clive learns new abilities throughout all the Icon fights, so he continues to evolve. But the next scene is the really important one. Here we see Phoenix fighting Bahamut. Now, this scene has massive implications. First, let me get it straight that this fight is happening either right before or right after the Ifrit Bahamut fight, as you can see the giant flower in the background. In fact, here you can see that there appears to be a whole city that is on fire at the base of the flower, and not just that, the flower appears to be on what is either an island or peninsula. You can see more land over here, so everything in between is ocean. Now, I'm struggling to place it with 100% certainty, but based on what we've seen before in the Bahamut fight, my guess is this might be taking place in the Crystalline Dominion, and maybe what we're seeing is the peninsula jut into the ocean around this area of the map. If this is the case, we are missing the giant mother crystal that should be somewhere here, so maybe this is just happening on some random island. But if this theory holds, I think I know the general order of events. In the Ambition trailer, we saw this scene with Ifrit fighting Bahamut before the flower opened. Then we have the fight with Bahamut on the flower after it blooms. Then, one way or another, we beat Bahamut, or he beats us. Maybe he tries to retreat, and then I think that ultimately leads to the Bahamut-Phoenix fight. Now, I think there are three potential explanations for Phoenix in this scene. One is that Joshua is still alive, and he comes with us to wherever this is to help us fight Bahamut. Two is that somehow Clive inherits Phoenix's power. So remember that we know that all dominants are chosen differently, but we know that Phoenix chooses its dominant based on the bloodline of the Duke. So normally it would pass from the Duke to their firstborn son. And of course, Clive didn't actually get chosen, and instead it went to Joshua, likely because he instead had Ifrit's power. So theoretically, if Joshua dies, it might go back to Clive. Of course, it skipped over him in the first place, so I find this very unlikely, but it is possible that somehow, some way, maybe when we meet Joshua on the volcano, that Clive inherits the power and can transform into Phoenix as well as Ifrit. I mean, to help support it, he still keeps Phoenix's power, even though Joshua apparently died, maybe? That would also support Joshua still being alive, of course, too. The third option is actually what I think is the most likely, and that is that Phoenix was inherited by someone else, again, following the inheritance path. Maybe it's a bastard of the Duke or the Duke's father, but somehow, some way, it went to the next in line for the throne, following a traditional royalty tree. Maybe it's the Duke's brother, or something like that. We don't entirely know the inheritance path. It's possible that Clive maybe has a sister, or maybe the Duke had a bastard daughter, and Phoenix doesn't care if it's male or female. They just pick like the next born descendant of this one line. We don't really know. But what I like about this theory is, let's say the Duke had a bastard kid who was maybe a couple years old at the very beginning of the game, and he didn't tell anyone about it. Maybe they're next in line to inherit the power, in which case this 18-year time skip would put them 18, 20 years old. And so the reason I like this theory so much is that it gives a reason why the developers put the time skips in that they did. So I'm assuming this happens after the second 5-year time skip. But with 18 years passing, almost anyone could be the new dominant. I've seen some people guess that maybe Mid is the dominant because she has very similar clothing to Joshua, and at least in terms of color palette. And that could make sense. Maybe she is Sid's daughter, but maybe she's the adoptive daughter, and then come to find out, oh, she's actually a descendant of the Duke because she was a bastard born of him and some maid, or something like that. Like, there's so much potential there. It's extremely easy to write in, and it makes a ton of sense, and it makes the time skips make a lot of sense. So that's why I like this option the most. I know some people want to think because Joshua dies early in the game that this has to take place before that death scene, so during the invasion of Rosaria of the Empire, but based on how much control Clive has over Ifrit at this point, I find it very unlikely that this is in the extreme early game. And I say the Ifrit Bahamut fight because I don't know if it would make sense to have the Ifrit Bahamut fight, the Phoenix Bahamut fight, then the Phoenix Ifrit fight ending in Joshua's death. That would be a lot to have in the opener. Alright, and now everything left, while very cool, is something that we've seen before, at least from a story perspective. So I'm going to stop it here. Thank you all so much for listening to all of this. This is actually my longest video yet, I think. We'll see after I'm done editing. And it definitely took the longest to try to go through everything and get all my thoughts out. Like I said earlier, I saw the music video that they posted with the theme song, and after watching it, I knew I had to make it its own video since there's just so much new stuff in it. So be prepared for that. If you liked the video, leave a like. If you want to see that next video, feel free to subscribe. And thank you everyone who comments and supports me. All I can say is I hope the next batch of content they release is a little less dense than this because boy am I tired. And so with that, I hope you all have a good night.